Hello everyone. It's really nice to see you. I'm Tina Altieri and I'm really delighted to be your, what do we call it, moderator, your guide, your MC for this particular panel, room number 3. And I'm so thrilled to be here this morning. And I've got a fantastic panel. I also have a couple of really great topics for us to get into. So I'm looking forward to spending the next 40 minutes with you. We're talking gendered drivers of violence, and we'll be diving deep into the complexities of gender drivers that perpetrate violence within the workplace in the mining industry. We've got a lot of experience, well-researched wisdom on the panel right now, and we'll be bringing them on. So allow me to introduce you to Damien Green, CEO of Stopping Family Violence. He's a passionate advocate and a researcher of perpetrator responses in Australia. Great to see you, Damien. Also, Kylie Lofton, she's manager at Sexual Assault Resource Centre. Thanks so much, Kylie. Alicia Taylor-Jones, a workplace lead at Our Watch, which is a non-for-profit organisation working to prevent violence against women and their children. And Jackie Woods, National Communications and Policy Director at Mining and Energy Union. Would you please make them welcome? Let's begin by getting some views and perspectives. There are 3 concepts that we're discussing when we talk about gender violence. Kylie Lawton, let's talk to you first about what is involved. It's a very, very broad topic, but we can really drill down into 3 things about what gendered violence is really all about. Could you explain?
Yeah, I can. I don't think I want to drill it down to just 3 things, but I do want to talk about 3 specific types of violence that people experience that are particularly gendered. Across the span of the day, we've been talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault, and I want to make it very clear that sexual harassment and sexual assault are 2 very different things. They're quite different experiences. They require different responses from the people who hear those stories, but they are also part of a continuum that isn't specifically and deliberately designed to go in that way. Not all sexual harassment results in a sexual assault. Not all sexual assault starts with sexual harassment. They are 2 discretely different things that can have a collision course that end in the same point. The 3rd factor that I want to talk about is family and domestic violence. So the idea that you might be assaulted or harmed in your home by someone that you are in an intimate relationship with. So specifically what I want to talk about is the fact that sexual assault might be perpetrated by a stranger or by someone you don't know, but equally it could be perpetrated by someone that you're in a relationship with. Family and domestic violence doesn't always include sexual assault, but what we know to be true is that it is a significant marker for severe family and domestic violence.
You all come to this panel with different perspectives. Now, Damien and Alicia are in the space of working to prevent sexual harassment and violence, while you, Kylie, work with the survivors after the incident. Jackie, you have a clear line of sight at both ends of the spectrum. So what, against that backdrop, would you say, and let's hear from each of you very briefly, what would you say is the biggest myth about gender-driven violence, and especially within the mining industry?
Okay, I'll kick off. Do you want me? I think from my point of view, and really trying to, provoke some thinking in the room, generate some questions. One of the biggest myths is that this is often seen as a women's issue. And that's not to say that the work that's happening around increased reporting, around supporting women in the workplace is not really important work. It absolutely is, and it's absolutely necessary in its own right for its own reason. But there's been a lot of talk this morning already about this idea of culture, the idea of the problems that exist in our culture that are, in some cases, ending up with the types of behaviours that we're here talking about. But who's responsible for that culture? Often it's men. We've heard today the data around people's experiences of violence, and we know that it is mostly women who experience this behaviour. But even for men who experience this thing, it's men perpetrating this behaviour. So we as men have a role to play. Now, I'm not saying that all men are bad. I'm not saying that all men are a problem. But what I'm saying is that the contribution we make to culture, our responsibility for changing culture, absolutely must equally rest on the shoulders of men and women.
Alicia, the biggest myth?
I would say one of the biggest myths we've got going in the workplaces is that, yes, we understand it's happening, but it's not happening that much, and it doesn't happen at our workplace. And the data just doesn't play that out. Particularly in the mining industry, within the last 12 months, we've seen 40% of women in the workplace experiencing sexual harassment. And I think the other part that plays into this as well is a feeling that we can't prevent it, that there isn't a way of stopping this from happening before it starts. And I would say to you that workplaces are places with codes of conduct. They're places with structures. The people that are using violence or sexual harassment or embedding gender inequality within workplaces have employment contracts. They have ways that they are expected to behave within the workplace, and we have mechanisms to support them to do so appropriately.
To your point, can I just have a show of hands? Who believes that you're employed at a workplace where sexual assault or sexual harassment is not an issue? Can you just raise your hands where it's not an issue at your workplace? Can you raise your hands? 2, 3, a handful. Any more? Where you don't believe that sexual harassment or sexual assault is an issue at your workplace? Interesting. Okay. Jackie, what about you? The biggest myth?
Well, I would say a myth is that if we just bring more women into the workplace, that the culture will improve. And I don't think that we see that happening in reality. Certainly, it's a fantastic thing that a lot more women are entering the mining industry because women deserve those opportunities and they love their jobs and they're really good at it. But we have seen a lot of examples of a big influx of women into workplace cultures that are quite toxic for them, and they don't have the support that they need necessarily, and there hasn't been the investment in the culture change or actually just logistical things to support them, right down to the very basics of, actually women just having access to toilets remains a really big issue for women operators in the mining industry. Let alone just being subjected to sexual harassment, to things like power imbalances in the workplace. And also, a lot of the women that are entering the mining industry are young, and there are generational differences as well. So one of the things that I find a lot from talking to our members is that the older women who've been around for a long time, they've had to put up with a lot in order to survive in the industry. They've got extremely thick skins. They're not all, sometimes they also don't sort of recognise the problem. There is a generational difference. I find our younger women members just don't want to be, they're not accepting.
In other words, they just want to get on with it.
Which is correct. And sometimes the older women don't. So I just would just like to challenge this idea that simply bringing women in is not enough, and there needs to be a lot of investment in, making sure that the workplace is appropriate for them, and that the leaders actually owning what their circumstances are in the workplace.
Who would agree with that? That just simply hiring more women is not enough. It doesn't go far enough. Okay, interesting. Kylie, I'm really fascinated by what you have as a couple of the myths when it comes to gender-driven violence.
Okay. SARC as an agency focuses on sexual assault. So we are an after the horses bolted agency. We are only dealing with victims of sexual assault. We aren't working in the spectrum of harassment. We aren't working in workplace safety. We're working supporting people who have health and counselling requirements after they've experienced a sexual assault. The two biggest myths that we come across in our line of work are that women only report sexual assault to make trouble for men. That there is this idea that false reporting is incredibly high, and that women are out there making up stories to challenge the blokes that have been difficult for them to work with or that they have issue with. And I would put it to you all that with regard to that, have a look anytime you like at how the judicial system and the health system works for people who've experienced sexual assault, and tell me whether you would be prepared to do that on a lark, because it just doesn't happen. The international data and the national data across Australia suggests that false reporting of sexual assault is less than 2% of the total number of reported incidents, and we know the incidents are underreported in this country. The second myth that comes up a lot for us is that you weren't hurt, so therefore it can't have been a sexual assault, that you've got no bruises, no bashing, no this, no that, no the other. If you're not injured in the occurrence of the sexual act, that you therefore must have consented in some way. And what we know to be true is that people experience flight, fright, freeze and fawn. And the safest thing for you to do if you are being assaulted and having sex with someone who you don't want to have sex with is actually fawn, because it stops you from being hurt. And just less than 50% of the people that come through our agency have no physical injury at all. We do have a range of people who have a variety of injuries that come to us. We've seen some terrible things in our agency. Bad things happen during unwanted sex acts. But the myth that if you are not injured, it can't have been assault, permeates throughout the community, and it's a really difficult one to challenge.
Mm-hmm. Does that resonate with anyone in the audience, those 4 Fs? Have you heard that before? Had you heard the third and the fourth? Yes, okay. Alicia, you've got some interesting stats on what are those drivers, because I think this audience would be very interested to hear some of that latest information.
And I'll refer to my notes so I get the stats right. Thanks, Tina. So when we're looking at gender drivers of violence, from our Watch's research and through Anne Rose and the like over the years, the key driver is gender inequality. It's where we decide that people of a particular gender, and in this case women, are somehow inferior or not as good as men. And that underlying idea permeates all of the violence that we see perpetuating along gendered violence. And it has 4 reinforcing factors as well. So the idea we find in workplaces where violence against women in whatever form is excused or condoned. It was just a joke. He's been here a long time. He's just like that. And that's just the way it is here, and you just need to grow a bit of a thick skin. We also find where men have disproportionate levels of control in workplaces. So whether that's profit and loss responsibilities, leadership, people leadership roles and the like, where they have a significant amount of control over the careers of women. We'll also see, and this plays out a lot in mining workplaces, I think Damien's going to speak perhaps to an example of it, around where we see ways of men bonding in the workplace through the degradation of women, where there's a bonding experience in the way that men can actually create their peer groups and their social groups is around denigrating, insulting, joking about women in the workplace. And I'm aware of time, so I'll move more quickly, but with the workplace sexual harassment in particular, we're finding in the mining industry that male perpetrators are slightly higher in the mining industry than across the Australian workforce more broadly, sitting at 83% rather than the national rate of 79%. And one thing I did want to drive home, Tina, was that not all women experience gendered violence equally. And in fact, what we do see is that different forms of identity, characteristics and experiences intersect with gender as well. So whilst we have a baseline statistic that 39% of all women in Australian workforces experience sexual harassment, should you be Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander woman, you're substantially more likely to experience it in the workplace at the rate of 55%. Similarly, women living with a disability are more likely to experience it at 52%, as well as people of diverse sexual orientations at 52%. And we see that young women are more than twice as likely to experience sexual harassment in the workplace. So there's an age element to this as well.
Yeah. We're getting lots of questions. We'll come to those in just a minute. Let's just quickly go to you. Let me pick up on something that Alicia had actually said, Damien, about this bonding. It's a male-dominated workplace. How does that play out in the workforce? And how is it that it's got to this?
Yeah, thanks. Look, there's a couple of reflections that I have around that. So when we start to really think about the role of male peer relations, what does that mean in the context of our workplaces? But I think more broadly, what does that mean in the way that we conduct our lives? And so we've spoken a lot today about leadership, but there is also the everyday lived experience of people and the way that those two things intersect, right? So a lot of the stuff that we hear about, a lot of the stuff that we talk about might be happening around work. It might be happening on the to's and fro's to work, and it might be in our social interactions associated with those that we work with, right? And so that's not purely a workplace and it's not purely a social situation, it's a mix of both. But the social conventions that govern us as individuals, and then in terms of the way that we identify as men, and then the way that masculinity has a role to play in terms of that, absolutely governs the way that people behave. It contributes to the way that people feel behaviours are acceptable or behaviours aren't acceptable. It provides the containment, or in some cases doesn't contain, it colludes with different perspectives that we might not necessarily agree with. And so what we see is those factors really coming into this space in terms of men's behaviour and the conditions which allow these sort of really undesirable things to happen around us.
So let me get to the crux of this. So what are you talking about? I mean, you're talking about the men's behaviour. Are you suggesting that the companies hire perpetrators? Yes, they exist all around us. Perpetrators are not our type of person that we can readily identify. Perpetrators don't walk around with a red flashing light to say, this is what I do, this is what I believe. The way that our social conventions help us to govern people's behaviour, the way that we achieve social change is by challenging those behaviours which we don't like, or to collude with behaviours that we do. And so what we see, what I'm trying to get to, is that, when we are interacting as men and the way that we behave with each other, whether that's at work or in our social environment, will absolutely have an impact on the way that those around us behave. I recently came across an example of this in practice. So 2 of my very good colleagues have been doing some research around the state. They had an experience at one of our regional airports just recently, where there was a group of men sitting around at the airport. They were publicly watching porn with their volume on. I can tell you that there was probably 200 men and a few women around them, and that behaviour wasn't challenged. And in fact, the colleagues, both of them young women, were really confronted by that. For obvious reasons, they weren't going to step in and challenge that. But I think that speaks to the challenge that we have in this space. Now, what we know from the research, if I went and interviewed a lot of those men would say that that is absolutely unacceptable. I think most of us here would agree that that is absolutely unacceptable. Was it challenged? Was anything done about it? Did any of those 100 men, even though the majority there probably would have supported bystander action, it didn't happen. And I think that's the challenge when we take it away from leadership and bring it back to us as individuals. What do we need to do in this space? It's those micro behaviours, those things that are in the everyday that speak volumes about what we need to do. I think just referencing Holly's comment this morning, the behaviour we walk past is the behaviour we accept. That's that example, right? Those men that were watching that porn did not get a social narrative that said what they were doing was not okay. So you mean to say, and is anyone else shocked by that? I'd love to know, is anyone shocked by that? So you mean to say, when has it become acceptable to do that? I don't understand.
Can I chime in and go one better? We've had the experience, our education and training team have had the experience of people watching porn in the back of SARC sessions.
Jackie, let's hear from you. You know, certainly paint a bit of a grim picture, but there's a lot that you're trying to do in the back engine as well. How does it play out from your perspective?
Well, you know, we've sort of surveyed and talked to members, and there are a lot of experiences that are really, you know, difficult, from, you know, actual sort of really overt harassment of women. You know, I've spoken to members who just say to me, I cry every day before I go to work because they just feel this onslaught of sort of unwanted male attention. There's often, you know, people feel, I think especially in the more remote locations, there's kind of, people feel pressure for sex, they're badgered for sex, or, you know, they're sort of constantly asked out on dates. And then there's the, you know, I guess just a lot of behaviour that is just sort of inappropriate, probably jokes and things where, you know, for all of the negative stories, we also do hear really positive stories. So if women will, you know, just sometimes say, oh, the people on my crew are really supportive, and I know that I can rely on the guys in my crew to step in and tell someone to back off. And that sort of thing actually, I would say, changes their life if they've got people like that on their crew, or if a culture is developed in that crew of the guys being willing to just step in and say, hey, don't do that. But yeah, certainly, you know, the porn is certainly an issue that's come up, you know, that our women talk about. Guys watch it on the bus when they're all on their way, you know, from the airport or to the mine site or something, or they just feel too sort of scared to go to the laundry area after hours and those sort of things. So, like, there is really a whole range, but, you know, it's important to acknowledge as well that there are a lot of people responding to that, women and men, who also do step in and make a big difference in challenging it.
Thank you. Alicia, a question from the audience. How do I challenge the views of men? How do I do that?
Well, I think a few of us could take that one. I think there's a few answers to that, and I want to acknowledge first the challenge with that, and that's, as Damien highlighted actually, that there was not a social narrative there that what somebody was doing was not okay. And it takes a real sense of security and psychological safety for somebody to stand up and say a behaviour that they've seen over and over again and seen gone unchallenged over and over again in a workplace setting, that it's not okay. We're asking men generally to do that because women have been trying to do this fight for a really long time. They're also in the vast minority in particularly mining workplaces. But men pay a social penalty for doing that. There is a risk of being ostracised from your peer group. There is a risk of it initiating bullying for people who speak up. So how do we do it? We need to actually start at the top. We need a marrying of the top and the bottom and the people that are on the front line. We need leadership to actually have a really clear commitment and signal as to what is appropriate and what's not in their workplace.
So you're saying that leadership is not that strong at the moment. We can't even shut that sort of, you know, some would call it, you know, this sort of low level behaviour down. We can't shut that down yet? Leaders can't do that?
Leadership of mining companies, but
Yeah.
and mainly because they're incredibly varied. Some people are doing incredible work in this space. Some are at a very early part of this journey, but we do need to see it from leadership teams, from executive teams, from the boards, as to what they expect the conduct of their behaviour of their staff to be. And we need them to hold staff accountable, their people leaders accountable, the team members accountable. I think accountability is one big challenging piece in all of this. Given a skill shortage as well, there is pressure to not move on staff who perhaps have undesirable behaviours in the workplace. But what we're increasingly seeing is that, I guess from a skill shortage perspective, you are going to have larger attrition, you are going to lose staff, you are going to have more issues. And particularly with the new Respect to Work amendments and the movement to a positive duty on employers to provide a workplace that is not hostile on the terms of sex. After December this year, we will see how that plays out with the Australian Human Rights Commission and organisations that don't lead from the top and aren't shown to take reasonable and proportionate steps to create a workplace that is not hostile on the forms of sex, but is inclusive and supportive of gender equality, may very well see consequences.
I mean, interested to know in the audience, who has a solution about getting rid of that low-level sort of behaviour? Any solutions that have come through in your organisations that you feel have really made some positive changes? I'd be keen to know. Please do use the Slido so we can highlight some of the great work that has been done, because we know that there is some good work happening. Let's Damien, please.
I think just to build on that, I think what we know is that when we do provide that reassurance to our workforce that we're going to be behind them if they do speak up and really mean that. If they feel like the organisation's structure, and I don't just mean at the top, but all the way through, is going to back them up in terms of speaking out, in terms of if there's any repercussions, if they feel safe, both from a psychological but also from an employment perspective. And a lot of men do talk a lot about the risk, because there is a big social risk to speaking up against particular groups of men. And so those things can make a huge difference to the way in which we encourage bystander participation, the way that we encourage people to speak out when they see those things that are not okay. I think the big win here, to really look at the silver lining, is that more and more people do personally believe that a lot of these things is not okay. Right, so I think we are seeing change. We are seeing shifts in perspective. What we need to do now is translate that individual knowledge into action. And I think that's where we're really struggling, is how do we get action in groups of ordinary people, both men and women, for want of a better way of putting it, on the front line.
Kylie, I'm interested to get your perspective on when a sexual assault does come to the fore. How is it handled? Do you feel that we've made enough positive ground in terms of how we deal with that? So we send a message to people that it is okay to speak up, to come forward. We know that not all sexual assault victims, for example, want to come out with lights blaring, want to make an immediate police report. That's not the pathway they want to go towards, coming full circle and trying to heal themselves after a horrific incident like that. What's your experience, and have we got that right yet?
Possibly not. I think we're getting better at it. We certainly are entering an era where we talk more about trauma-informed care and about being responsive to victims and not blaming people who come forward and report incidents that have occurred to them. But I think that the institutional responses across the whole of society sometimes leave a bit to be desired in that space. It can be really difficult for people to speak up. It can be really difficult for them to say, this was my experience. The very first person that you tell almost always cements who you tell next and what you do. That first response that you have when you speak up to someone and say, this happened to me, has a huge impact on what you do next. And if that first response is, oh, I know him, it probably didn't go down that way, or are you sure that's what happened? Or maybe you just had a bit much to drink, like those kind of things that kind of minimise the experience. Those things have an impact on what people do next in terms of help seeking. And that's both at an individual and at an institutional level. And I guess I would just throw into the mix there that not every person who experiences a sexual assault wants to report it to the police. Not every person who experiences a sexual assault wants to tell their family that they've experienced that. And not every person who has experienced a sexual assault even wants it known outside of the immediate help that they seek while they're dealing with that scenario. I also want to make it really clear that experiencing sexual assault is not a downslide into doom and gloom for the rest of your life. People recover from the trauma of sexual assault and they recover very well. Some people are able to pack that away and not have it come back again at any point in their lives. But what we know to be true in our agency is that we have, for every person who comes to us for treatment for a recent sexual assault, who seeks out our service for medical care and for psychosocial intervention, there are 4 people who come to us for something that happened a long time ago that's still affecting them and still coming up in their lives. And so I don't want you to walk away with the impression that sexual assault is the end of the world for the victim, but help is out there, and it's actually better if you speak up. And if someone tells you that they've had that experience, listen to them and validate what they're saying. Because the pathway that they choose after they've spoken to you is in some way guided by how you respond.
We've had a good response to that topic, and someone's written, we have stops for safety across a site for an incident. When will we see stops for respect across a site? Have any of you seen that before?
I'm assuming that that's an incident response in the mining industry. You have to forgive me, I'm a health department employee, so not that au fait with what happens on mine sites. But I would imagine that the suggestion there is that if something happens in an incident, that you stop everything and you talk about it, you debrief what happened and make sure that there's no transferable or continuing problem with that issue. The idea of stopping and saying we've had a respect breach, we need to talk about how that affected the team, how everyone responds to that. That's not a bad idea. But I would also go down that pathway of, remember, not every victim wants to talk to you about what their experience has, and not every victim is going to want you to have a stop work meeting and discuss what they've just talked about. That there has to be a kind of a grey line in the sand that's quite wide.
Yeah.
And I think likewise, we know the same thing applies in terms of those that are causing harm. So the first response they get is often a really important part of behaviour change process. So if they get those behaviours reinforced, or somebody colludes with them or buys into a victim blaming narrative, we know that has lots of implications for change. And likewise, if they get a really accountable response from whoever it is that's found out, whether that's friend, family, co-worker, whatever, that's going to really motivate them to engage in a change process and be more accountable. So that really matters. But the same, we've got to be very mindful of the way that shame operates in this space. So that kind of public outing can actually be very counterintuitive to behaviour change, and it can cause people to go inward, and that can be incredibly dangerous. And we know that some of the death review data, particularly around family violence, is that heightens risk. So we've just got to be really, really mindful in terms of how these things come together to provide a whole response around the person experiencing the violence, but also those that are causing it, and find the best path forward that's going to be really victim-centred and meet the needs of all concerned.
Jackie, you spoke very briefly earlier about the fact that the women who might come out and say that this has happened to them invariably leave the industry, and it's almost their last horrific hurrah before they leave. If I could be the devil's advocate, and certainly from what I've heard in 30 years in the media business, where, to be honest, when an industry is so driven by commodity prices, and when prices are high, they don't sack anybody. They don't sack perpetrators. They don't sack people who've conducted these sort of and instigated these incidences, because they've got an important skill, and we know that those skills are widely needed here in WA. What sort of hope should I have if as a woman, that we're not going to get to the bottom of this?
It is. It's very difficult, and a lot of women do leave, and I thought that was a good insight from Professor Parker's presentation before about people exiting the industry or being more likely to quit their jobs. It's certainly. I've seen multiple women change jobs or leave the industry because of their experience of sexual harassment. And the reason, I liked the comment about the respect stop, because, perhaps it's a measure of, teaching people a lesson, but it's actually a signal to the companies that, hang on, this is it is another form of safety issue, and production may be impacted sometime. Like, you can't, this sort of relentless drive for production, there need to be some limits on that. And so I would see that as a signal to the top end as well as the workers about what they do. But yes, look, we just do need to recognise, like, the fair treatment of people can be impacted by different things. So certainly I've heard lots of stories about a sexual harassment incident may be reported. Sometimes the woman ends up losing her job because there's been some other breach. Maybe she had her phone on her when she wasn't supposed to, so she's not technically being sacked over reporting the sexual harassment issue, but there's another reason she ends up losing her job. Sometimes with the men, they just get moved or, moved around. I mean, sometimes they do lose their jobs as well, of course, but sometimes, especially if they have an in-demand skill, they're moved on somewhere else. So these are, some of the challenges that, do need to be addressed, because, I think that point of people trusting that there's going to be fair treatment, whatever their involvement is in the scenario, is really important to sort of just winning that confidence and trust of workers that they can talk about these. We have members who, women who are too scared to make a complaint. And what I did mean to say earlier is, if people want to see how the sort of repercussions can work for women, our member Astacia Stevens gave a submission to the parliamentary inquiry that just spelt out in really shocking detail about what happened to her, resulting in her being sort of blacklisted and not being able to be employed. To men, I mean, they have a lot of fears as well about how their behaviour could be treated, and sometimes that there's more education that's needed there about sort of appropriate behaviour. So
we're told too that Rio do a stop for respect, stopping the entire WA operation so teams and their leaders talk about respectful behaviours. Someone's asked, what does trauma-informed care mean? Kylie?
So trauma-informed care is a type of healthcare that puts the patient at the very centre of the circumstance of treatment. It is aimed at providing you with individualised care that is specific to your need at the time that you present. There is a current move in the health kind of environment to think about trauma-informed care in all parts of the aspects of healthcare that we provide, including in aged care, in mental health care, and in looking at how we provide care to people in general and surgical units across the state. Trauma-informed care is about recognising the fact that each person that you meet may have some undisclosed trauma that sits underneath their presentation and that drives the way that they behave while they're interacting with you. And if you can provide them with individualised care that is respectful of any potential trauma and offers them the support that they need in that point in time, you will be able to provide more holistic and more appropriate health care in that space. For those of you who are particularly interested, SARC has some amazing short animation clips on our website that talk about trauma-informed care in health settings. Our focus at SARC, and I can see Rosie in the audience, I know there's a couple of other SARC staff members around here today. Dr. Rosie would back me up on saying that our focus is on doing exactly what needs to be done for that patient at that point in time. We're about giving patients back their choice, advising them about what options they have, and giving them the choice to decide what that pathway that they select will be. We have a saying at SARC, nothing about you without you. That's the way that we function, and that's what trauma-informed care looks like for us.
Say that again, nothing?
Nothing about you without you.
We're getting to the final few minutes, everyone, so let's now hear from the panel, the final remarks from the panel. I don't know about you, but we've covered off a lot of topics that make me think that there is a lot to do going forward, whether it's in the culture space, institutional space. Can we just get the final comments from each of you about what needs to change now? What do we need to turn the dial on to make a difference from your knowledge, your expertise, the experiences that you've had? What needs to change now? Damien?
I think from my perspective, like we've already heard about this morning, some really great initiatives and desire by leadership to make changes in this space. And I think that's really fantastic. I think the challenge is for everybody is how do you translate that to your everyday, right? How do you go and encourage change with those around you? How do you bring in people that are not in this room into this journey, this process around cultural change? Because you can't change culture by telling culture it needs to change. You need to be part of it. You need to be in it. It's an infiltration strategy. And so all of us are agents in that. So I think what people need to do is go away and think, okay, well, what can I do in addition to what we're already doing, in addition to my job, or in addition to, you know, what it is that I'm paid to do in this space? What can I do both personally and professionally to shift the dial a little bit further? How do I challenge my peers? How do I, you know, have conversations? If you're a man, how do you have conversations with other men around your parenting, right? How are we telling other men that change in this space is good for men? It is. We know from so many indicators that change around gender equality, change around transforming masculinity, change around healthy masculinity or healthier masculinity is good for men. You know, being active, involved fathers is good for men. So how are you having conversations with those peers around you? How are you talking about and bringing men into this space? And please, if you ever see anybody trying, whether they're a man or a woman, trying to challenge something, be a backup. Because it's that reinforcement that absolutely makes a difference to that idea of colluding or not with what we see around us.
So who's going to answer the next one about what needs to change? And maybe can I just segue with a quick question? Can dinosaurs change?
Yes.
Can people change?
I believe that people can change. You know, there may be some people who really have hardcore views, but a lot of people, you know, the sort of older blue-collar men in the industry, a lot of them do have quite outdated ideas around, you know, what's funny and the kind of workplace banter that is funny and acceptable. But I do believe it can change, and we have seen change over years. I mean, people used to think it was okay to make racist jokes as well as a kind of banter, but there's been a lot of progress there. So I do believe. But I guess my point of, you know, what we need to do is just, you know, training needs to be really practical and involve the workers and listen to them about what they need, as well as lecturing them about what they need to do.
Alicia?
I think there's a real opportunity for the mining industry in particular, given the really rigorous workplace health and safety frameworks that mining companies already have in place. And somebody's already spoken to the fact that, you know, we don't incorporate psychosocial risks, including sexual harassment, into those frameworks effectively. So I think there's a real opportunity there, whilst being cognizant of privacy and confidentiality and trauma-informed care for people who report sexual harassment or disrespect in the workplace, that the frameworks are already there. You already know what the responses can be. You already have the risk matrices to actually assess where this is happening in your business, who is it happening to, and how can you actually structure things to be different. I think there's never been a greater wealth of resources around this very specific topic at the moment. I know the Respect in Mining report says they'll be publishing their website in October. Our Watch has workplace.ourwatch.org.au that has a whole range of free resources for organisations to tap into. And we also have the newly launched Our Watch Institute, which will happily work one-on-one with quite large organisations in designing workplaces that are safe by design in preventing gender inequality and sexual harassment.
And we are seeing some great work being done out there as well. Kylie, would you agree?
I do agree, and I think some of the things that we talked about earlier today are things that you can look at rolling out in the place that you work in. I was particularly intrigued by the idea that we promote leadership, women in leadership. Do we have pathways for managing that? Does your work environment support women to be climbing the ladder? Are there opportunities for that? I think the biggest and most important thing that you can do, and each and every one of us can do this today, it can start right now, is change the messaging that we have. And I'm going to give you an example of what I think is worrying messaging. I want to talk about employee assistance programs. We've heard people talk already this morning about the EAPs and about the fact that there are EAPs available. If the only thing that you talk about your EAP is to tell people that if they're upset they can go and talk to the EAP, then you're not targeting the behaviours that need to change in your organisation. Because all you're saying to your people who've experienced sexual harassment or sexual violence is go and talk to someone about how you feel so you can stay at work longer. If your EAP message is you talk to someone about your anger management, are you worried about your relationship? Are you worried about the way that you talk to women? Use your EAP to be more accountable, to hold people accountable and to send the other people off to have counselling and support around their behaviours, not just your victims. Don't just use your EAP for that. Change your messaging around your EAP. Talk to your EAPs about what they can provide and actually extend that and look at a broader spectrum of opportunity to hold people accountable for their behaviour.
I'm sure you'd agree. Some great insights. Would you please thank Damien, Kylie, Alicia, and of course Jackie. Thanks so much.